thank you all. I know you would have been there for me if I disappeared. It was sketchy but luxurious, the trip, and I can't. Let's see if I can get this to work here. So.
I'll take the handheld, I think, because usually I move too much for clip-ons. Okay, let's see if this will work. So at any rate, I was kind of inspired to be kind of TED Talky because some of our speakers were TED people, and I thought it might be sort of fun to see how this all, see if I can manage to do this. Okay, so as you all know, I was spontaneously invited to go to Colorado. So one of the most important things I learned right away, let's see. That's the crazy part. I had no idea. Okay, so I was invited to go to Colorado, and it came up kind of spontaneously after the Designing Across the Divides conference. I met a gentleman named Tim Gilman, who was a speaker there, and he called me about a month later, and he said, okay, so we want to pay for you to come out to Colorado. And I don't know if I've talked to you guys about this before, but I have a spiritual bargain that I have with the deity, which is that if I get asked to do something that seems like something God would want me to do, I always say yes. Okay? Sometimes I think I'm not exactly sure that's exactly the best idea. Corey is really upset about the cats. But I still say yes, and usually things are very uncomfortable. They're awesome. I learn a lot. I have great experiences. I save people's lives and whatnot with my body parts. Whatever it is, it's great. But it usually involves three things. An incision, driving, or, because God does not have a car, no matter what anybody thinks, or cats. I'm sorry, Corey. So at any rate, I was asked to go on this trip to Colorado, and I didn't know anything about it. I could imagine myself camping and being, like at a cult, and which is why last week I told folks to please come and get me. 2 weeks ago I said, please come and get me if I don't show back up. What it turned out to be was a little bit different. But the reason I guess I was asked to go is because Christians are desperate. So that's where I was. It's really hard to see exactly how beautiful it is from the photos, but let me see if we can kind of get it scrunched in a little bit. So I was in the Rocky Mountains, like in Ridgeview, Colorado, and it was super shishi digs, okay? This is not my caliber of experience, typically. And so from the very beginning, it was suspicious because people had way more money than I expected that they would. And so I think it's always a good thing when you are in an experience where you're receiving some kind of present to figure out who's paying for it and why. Because I wasn't sure. I didn't want to do something that was really being funded by diamond mines, I guess. But it's almost as bad. It's a bunch of people on Wall Street who feel very, very bad about Donald Trump. And so I'm not going to say one thing or the other. This is not really a political setting, other than to say that there are many Christians who feel very concerned about the political religious structures that they have been building over the past 40 years that have resulted in our current situation. Some of them are directly related in creating some of these power structures that are essentially like an alignment of just religion and power. They were directly related with starting Bible studies with Gerald Ford, for example, and Ronald Reagan, and creating the evangelical power structure, I guess. And some of them were not directly involved. Some of them are just really concerned about the conflation or mixing up of the idea of being a Christian and being in alignment with empire. So what it turned out to be was a group exercise that was sponsored by some of these folks who had funded and created this power structure, along with many different Christians from across a broad spectrum of people who have been struggling either within this structure or outside of it. So some of them, we had Seventh-day Adventists, Methodists, Catholics, there were non-denominational folks. Tim Gilman comes from the Assembly of God, and me, so I covered a whole bunch of stuff. It was really interesting because there were people that were really struggling. A lot of folks from the United Methodist congregations are deeply, deeply struggling because of recent rulings by the United Methodist sort of hierarchy and votes by other United Methodist clergy that now defrock individuals who marry people who are gay. And for many United Methodist congregations, that's not a rule that's going to work because they'll all be defrocked. So we had people struggling, trying to figure out what they would do if they're either kicked out of their denominations, people who were trying to decide whether they were going to continue being in the ministry or whether they were going to shift their jobs. We had the Catholic gentleman was from the St. Francis Service Association, which does the social justice actions for folks who work under the name of St. Francis. So they do a lot of work in immigrant communities. They do a lot of work with Catholic charities. And what was interesting to me is that a lot of these folks are really struggling because they're where Anabaptists have been for hundreds of years. Struggling with the issue of whether or not Christians should participate in the military, whether Christians should participate in governmental structures that appear to be oppressing the poor, for example. It was kind of fun. Every once in a while, people would say something that was really obvious to me, and I'd be like, well, the Anabaptists don't do that. Which was nice. It's nice to be in that position. But it was really a group of people who are struggling with what it means to be a Christian. There was a big discussion about whether people should call themselves Christians at all, whether they should come up with another name. Jesus Freaks was brought back. I try to remind everybody that it's a privilege, to be able to pick and choose whatever name you're being called, and that if you are trying to be a Jesus freak, that someone eventually is going to call you a Christian. Some people were not happy with that. But we had a lot of really long conversations about what it means to follow Jesus in the present day, and what that looks like. So I was wondering why I ended up in this situation. And I was trying to figure it out, and I eventually accepted it. I have been a part of a lot of churches. Yeah, I know, right? I was actually like thinking about that. Linda just mentioned that I forgot the Lutherans, and they're not really forgettable, right? I think I'm going to claim trauma there, not because of the worship services, which are all the same, but because I had a really traumatic experience teaching high school Sunday school in a Lutheran church, so I'm convinced that's why I forgot it. But, so the list includes Southern Baptist, American Baptist, Pentecostal, Holiness, Assembly of God, United Methodist, UCC, Church of Christ, Christian Missionary Alliance, Unitarian, Mennonite Church of the Brethren. I claim that you guys are 2 for 1, and non-denominational, and Lutheran, and I will correct that immediately.
Who's the preacher?
What? That's, of course, Billy Sunday. Okay, so well, and one of the things that I thought about as I was going through this day after day after day was like,
Billy Sunday?
Billy Sunday is... Billy Sunday, for those of you who don't know, is a famous fire and brimstone preacher from the turn of the century.
They named the day of the week after him, what can you say?
Yes, they did name the day of the week after him. But he was known for Bible thumping. He was known for intense, like, faith healing ministries and very engaged.
Tempered Bibles.
He was ferocious. He was not. He was not going to punch the Bible in the face. But like many. Okay, he's a really great example because, like many of the pastors that I had as a young person, he had a certain personality, and his ministry was very personality-driven, which I have a whole bunch of theories about the complications that are involved in that kind of preaching and that kind of interaction with parishioners. But that is a very... I feel like I was very lucky because I've had a lot of extremely intense church-related experiences. And a lot of evangelicals don't necessarily know how to talk about that or how to relay that to other people, and that's something they don't have to explain to me. So I feel very privileged and lucky. I think that this is a big part of it. Now, so I kind of was really influenced by a lot of these people. My mother was the guy on the left. That's Billy Graham, for those of you who don't know. And you can't tell who the guy on the right is, but let's see, how do we get him sorted out here?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so that's Billy Graham on the left. How many of you know who Billy Graham is? Okay, a few of you, right? I mean, he was probably the most powerful and influential evangelical minister for, 50 years. And he would call out stadiums of people, 50,000, 70,000 people. My mother was saved in one of his Coliseum church services, and then my mother worked for Oral Roberts. That guy's on the right. So is anybody familiar with Oral Roberts? Yeah. So my mom worked for Oral Roberts for about 10 years. And Richard Roberts. There's a funny story about that. My brother broke Richard Roberts' collarbone.
Sumo wrestling.
Okay, so it's a long story, but I'll tell it anyway. So Richard Roberts was having an employee picnic, and Richard Roberts is the son and the heir apparent to Oral. And
Move that forward.
You got to move it forward to go through.
no, it's just not adjusted quite right.
There it is, that's perfect.
Okay. So they were having an employee picnic, and they were sumo wrestling. You know those big inflatable sumo suits?
Yeah.
And my brother at the time was 13 years old, and 6 feet tall, and 200 pounds, and he knocked Richard Roberts over and broke his collarbone.
But they did not lay hands on it.
They did not. They did not faith heal him. They called the ambulance. So Oral, for those of you who don't know, he ran probably one of the largest, wealthiest television / evangelical educational ministries ever seen in the history of the world. He ran a what, honey?
40 million by Friday or
Right. At one point, his empire included a medical school, a university, a church that I think held 30,000 people, a TV network, a television ministry, and my mother worked in the prayer part of the television ministry. And to be honest and fair, you would not want, if you're the person who's calling Oral Roberts in the middle of the night, my mother would be the person that you would want to pray for you, because she's a believer. So I have been privy to a lot of the changes that have taken place politically and from a religious perspective, and sometimes against my will. So during a period of time, so some of the things that we saw happen in evangelical communities over time included things like the challenge to the white evangelical church in the South that came from desegregation. That was a huge issue. For my family personally, that was not a big issue, but a lot of the things that were done in response to that, sort of the white flight, the idea that began to be spread that children should never go to public school because the public school could not be adequately controlled by a common shared religious history in a community, a real focus on homeschooling, Christian schooling, refusing to teach evolution, refusing to accept the idea of the equality of women. A doctrine called complementarity. Has anybody ever heard of that? And that's a doctrine that basically all denominations have believed in at one point, and that is that some more than others, all religions across the world believe some part of this. Complementarity is the idea that women are to be submissive to their spouses. And that, in Christianity, this is expressed as Christ is the head of the church, and the man is the head of the home, and if I believed in that, obviously we would have fewer cats. But this is a very complicated doctrine that I think is one of the most damaging doctrine that's currently held by evangelicals and fundamentalists today. Because it, from my point of view, in my work with victims of domestic violence and child abuse, this doctrine is singularly, and its expression, whatever it is, that women are somehow less than men and have less say over their lives and their worlds. This single doctrine is responsible for more child abuse and more harm to families and children than any other doctrine. But that doctrine and these complicated ideas, including an emphasis on eschatology, which is the end of the world, the way in which heaven and hell unfold, or how you get in or out of those post-life spaces, the potential of the rapture, the apocalypse, sort of a focus on Zionism as a mechanism for the coming end of the world. All of these eschatological and religious ideas are very much a part of what we experience as sort of the evangelical fundamentalist experience in America. And I feel lucky that I'm pretty familiar with these experiences and these ideas and how they express themselves in life. And I do believe that in the end, these are still my people. Whether I agree with them or not, I understand them. And so eventually I was like, what the heck, it's fine. Okay, so it was also good that I was there because I was from West Virginia, which is really, the beating heart of evangelism and fundamentalism in our part of the country. So 93% of West Virginians believe in God. 77% are absolutely certain God exists. Okay, this is about 15% higher than the general number of Americans. 39% of West Virginians are evangelical. 29% are mainline Protestant. But I think if you were to take a look at those mainline Protestant churches, most of them are more fundamentalist and evangelical than the run-of-the-mill mainline Protestant churches that you would typically find in a big city, for example. Only 3% of our population are members of non-Christian traditions, so that includes Hindus and Muslims and pagans, I suppose. 18% of our population has no religion. Okay, so I have a question because I was completely surprised. How many of you can guess what the gross domestic product of West Virginia is? It's 74.04 something. $74.04 billion. $billion.
What happens if you take Jim Justice out of that?
Yeah, $74 billion. The median income is $24,478. We are the state with the largest percentage of people who are dependent on federal assistance in the country. In education, we are number 44. In healthcare, we're number 48. Economically, we are 50 because it has nothing to do with our GDP. Crime is low, relatively low. As hard as it is to believe, we're the 21st in terms of crime. In terms of infrastructure, we are 50.
How is crime defined?
Well, I think it's probably, this is a U.S. News Report, World News Report. All of this data comes from there. Now, the stuff about the religious information, that comes from the Pew Trust. So you can take a look at those figures. I'm sorry I did not get all the sites in to my little slides, but I'm more than happy to share where I got the information. And it's important to take a look at that. Only 27% of the population is college educated because young people leave because they cannot find jobs. The jobs that they find are low paying. We have one of the highest populations of what they call young people. Well, it's basically just young people who are not doing anything, which is one of the main reasons why we have such a high drug use rate. Kids can't find work, they don't have hobbies, they're not going to school, they're not doing anything. And we have a very high population of those young people. And that's been true since 2008. It just goes on and on. Now, I realized as I was driving here that I forgot to put in a slide about you all, because that was a really good reason for me to be there. I would have said, if I was being asked by somebody outside of this church, I would have said my church is the main reason why I'm here, because we've covered a lot of this stuff already. And it helps to know. So, for example, one of the big discussions was, how do we move the church from believing in a creed to doing what Jesus asks us to do? And I was like, well, you just become Anabaptist. And then after that, it was surprising how many people would say things like, oh, those Anabaptists, they have it all together. So I was trying to represent. Okay, so this idea of, so what they're called is they're called common good Christians. And so I did a little bit of research about common good and the notion of common good, because I wasn't really familiar with this as an idea, but it turns out it's very old. In particular, it's very old in Catholic catechism. So I'm sorry about somehow that my little thing got mixed up over here on the left. So there's a verse, 1 Corinthians, after Paul is talking about the many different expressions of the Spirit, whether you're speaking in tongues or healing people or hospitality. And then the final verse in that chunk is, how now to each one the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. Okay, that's where common good comes from. We're not given the manifestation of the Spirit for ourselves. We're not given the manifestation of the Spirit so we can have a great day or feel elevated or feel spiritual. It is for a specific purpose. It's for the common good so that we can all benefit. One of the folks that is talked about when we talk about what this means in public life, because this is an idea that I think is sometimes not emphasized very much even in Anabaptist traditions, which typically have sort of an abstention model, that you abstain from civic life. In a conversation about these things where folks are trying to apply the notion of common good to public life, one thing that's quoted is a letter from Dionysius in 125 AD, and they're talking about what Christians are like. And they say, well, Christians don't dress differently, they eat the same things that everybody else eats, you can't really tell them apart. Yet the constitution of their own citizenship, which they set forth as marvelous, and confessedly contradicts expectations. I think it would be a big step if we could go forward to the point where Christian citizenship is considered marvelous and confessedly contradicting expectations. That seems remarkable to me. In the Catholic version, there's an elaborate catechism that, like all religious beliefs and traditions, sometimes is expressed more than other times. It presupposes respect for all persons. It assumes that public authority will support and respect the inalienable rights of all people, encourages the exercise of our natural freedoms, calls forth actions on the part of individuals that contribute to the well-being and proper moral framework of society, and then regarding government, it is the role of the state to defend and promote the common good of civil society, its citizens, and intermediate bodies. So, what this organization is trying to do is to take a place in the public square as a different kind of Christian with a focus on the common good, rather than some Christians who feel called to emphasize other aspects of what they feel is a critical part of their doctrine or creed. So one of the most important things that we talked about was privilege. And this is where the film fest came in. So there was 3 days of all gathering where we all gathered together and we talked about a lot of these issues. And then we went to the Mountain Film Fest where the theme was equity. And I cried about 2.5 hours a day. Because I think, when we live in West Virginia, we see a lot of challenges and difficulties, and it's very easy to come away with the belief that we're just in the most difficult place. We're in the hardest possible corner of the world. We have the worst economy. We just are struggling. But as I sat through panels, and then we sat through films, and then we sat through many different discussions about what equity looks like, it just really came home to me that we are privileged beyond belief. I'm privileged beyond belief. I am, and that as a person with privilege, I have the ability, the capacity, and the obligation to do what I can to strive for greater equity for other folks. And certainly that can play out in many different ways. But it did not help that the panel started out with a discussion of white fragility the very first day. Which, I refer to myself as a person of beige, so that's not going to cut it, really. When we think about where we stand in the world and what we can do, as Americans alone, we are so privileged. Often we get frustrated with the democracy that we live in and how democracy is expressing itself. But as participants in a democracy, we have a voice. We have more say than Jesus did in who the leaders of his government were going to be. When we think about our economic status, the amount of money that we spend per day, when we think about the fact that we belong to the country where we live, that we have access to citizenship, these are empowering, these are things that empower us. Okay? Every one of these things is a source of power to us, and it's an opportunity. And I know sometimes we get really caught up in feeling defensive about it. Well, we can feel like, okay, well, I've really struggled throughout my life. I've had to deal with a lot of trauma. At least this is what I hear in my own head sometimes. I'm like, I just can't do that much. I'm so tired. I have all this trauma to deal with, and I have, I had to work for everything. I had to borrow a lot of money to go to school, and I have a lot of stuff to take care of, and I have children who refuse to get up in the morning, and I have a lot of cats. But these things, being an American, having a right to participate in my democracy, having a remarkable economic status compared to the vast majority of the human world, citizenship, my race, my gender, even though I'm a woman, I live in a country where I can do a lot of things. And gender identity, I was born a woman and I get to identify as a woman. That just cuts out a lot of time and a lot of stress. Leisure time, right? I have time. I have time to do the work of Jesus. I do. So a lot of our conversation centered on what privilege looks like. Do you have it? What are you using it for? And what's your responsibility if you choose to identify as a Christian, or if you're comfortable with that, as a Jesus freak? So really, it kind of came down to the responsibilities to stand by the people Jesus stood for. So these folks might look familiar to you. What they did last year was they drove a bus through town. There's Steve Smith in the upper left-hand corner, down below them. That's Tim Gilman on the sort of left, and Eve Fox. What they did was they drove a bus through the country, and they would just talk about what it meant to be a Christian now, and what we could do to, how we could vote so that we could try to support the notion of common good. I just wanted to note a couple of things. They include people who follow a classic Christian creed and those who are only comfortable saying they want to follow Jesus. There's a wide spectrum of folks with experience in and out of the church. This is not a good place to find people who are trying to be traditionally compliant with church rules, probably. There's a wide spectrum of people who feel more or less comfortable with engaging in a wider hostile world, politically or ideologically. There were people who are really active. Tim Gilman and his wife do a lot of work in Liberia. They adopted a child from an orphanage there, and they've done a lot of work in Liberia. But that was not always the case. There are folks who have really attended and preached at sort of urban or suburban megachurches, who are completely uncomfortable with engaging in anything politically, but are now completely uncomfortable with just staying silent. So these are the commitments of Vote Common Good. So their goal is to focus on what they perceive to be the common good. So the voting in the nation's elections, that is for the common good, to make acknowledging that we're part of something larger than our own lives. We will vote with the poor, vulnerable, and forgotten in mind, with religious, racial, and gender minorities, with children and the elderly, with the sick and diversely abled, upholding the God-given dignity of all people, with no exceptions. We will vote with peace and safety in mind, and we will oppose policies and politicians who believe that more weapons and more threats of war will bring peace. We will vote with God's creation in mind, the oceans, rivers, and streams, the mountains, valleys, and farmland, the atmosphere, the delicate balance of nature, and our fellow creatures. We will vote against policies and politicians who promise special privileges for any religion, including our own. This is a very key part of the conversation, because for many of these folks, they have been working a long time to acquire special privileges for their religion. They have been working a long time to educate a group of people in universities that claim sort of the coming of Jesus to a table that's been previously set for him and completely lined with the evangelical right. That's been their goal. And so they're shocked at how these efforts have turned out. But it's very important to the majority of folks in this organization to make sure that there's no special privileges anymore for Christians, because that has not turned out well. And there's also an underlying belief that the mixing of a religion with empire and using the language of religion to secure political power and military power is not what Jesus calls us to do. We will vote for politicians who support laws against the corrupting influence of corporate and special interest group donations on our political system. So those are some of their larger commitments. Okay, so I saw many films while I was gone, and I'm going to try to bring them either to Morgantown or to this church so we can talk about them in Sunday school. Brooklyn Inshallah is about a Palestinian Lutheran Arab minister who was running for city council in Brooklyn. This was an excellent film because you could really see how a culture can be really divided along lines that cross any given section of humanity, and how difficult it is to reach human to human across those divides. But also the power of doing that. This was a Christian minister who really felt that he could improve the quality of life for his people. And so he ran for city council, and it's a very moving film. For Shama, this is available on, what's that? I think it's on Netflix, and it was a PBS documentary. How many of you listen to BBC?
Radio?
BBC Radio or PBS Radio. So during the siege of Aleppo, there was a doctor who kept calling out of the siege. He was a doctor, and he ran a hospital. I think it was the last hospital standing before the evacuation. And For Shama is a documentary that was made by his wife in real time, where she basically filmed in real time the things that were happening in that hospital. But it is about her daughter. Shama is her daughter, who's a toddler when the movie ends. And I have to say that that film just broke me. I mean, like, I don't even know how to explain it. It was just so terrifically heart-wrenching. Because we are privileged, and I'm privileged, and even though I like to think I understand what's going on across the world, like what is actually happening and what is so shocking. It is like a Holocaust. It is the Holocaust for these people. If you're dead, or you're dying, or you're surrounded by the bodies of the dead and dying, it doesn't matter whether they call it the Holocaust, or they call it a siege, or they call it whatever. It's the annihilation of entire groups of people by mass armaments. And just the things that you see happening to children in that film are just shocking beyond belief. Lazarus, no one's going to want to come to these movies. Lazarus was about a gentleman from Malawi who has albinism, and he just had like a #1 record, I think, in Africa recently. And his big work is about saving the lives of people with albinism, because there's it's when you people who are albino who lack pigmentation. But in Malawi, where he lives, people who are albino are considered magical, and they're kidnapped and murdered for their body parts.
It's not as a person, it's their flesh.
Yes, it's shocking. There's black witchcraft that happens around the bodies of these people and children. I mean, which is shocking. Like, I have no idea. I don't know. I just live in some weird world, I guess, where I don't know about that. But he was a super courageous person. He's married to this lovely lady, and they have these beautiful kids. And he was just an extremely inspirational person and told a really inspirational story. American Heretic, that is a great movie because I've not seen a documentary that really did such a beautiful job of pulling together sort of what happened in the Evangelical Fundamentalist Church from the 1950s and from the 1920s really and up. And it focuses on Oklahoma and Oral Roberts, actually, so that was a great film. And hopefully we can bring it to Martin. So, all right, so that's about it. That wraps everything up. Does anybody have any questions or want to know anything? Yes,
I'm
Kim?
just curious, I think of groups like Sojourners, and there are a bunch of different groups.
I guess I'm going to overlap.
Yeah. I was just wondering how those differ from other Christian groups that are like trying to be more concerned, but kind of opposing maybe a far right view of Christianity and like Sojourners.
I think, honestly, that a lot of these folks are coming out of denominations